Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Chitheads podcast. Today's episode is actually extracted from one of the sessions of the 30-day sadhana that I have been teaching for embodied philosophy. In this 30-day sadhana, we are exploring a particular text called the Matsyendrasaṃhitā, which is an early text associated with Hatha Yoga that also has a very interesting practice associated with the chakras and the yoginis that are associated with them. Initially, I had planned to just speak for about 10-15 minutes and then practice every day for the 30 days of this sadhana, but it's actually turned out to be about an hour every day. I spend about 30 minutes unpacking a particular concept. I explore some philosophical material that helps to contextualize the text historically and philosophically and to explore some of the worldview associated with the text. And we also, of course, explore various translations of different passages from the text itself. One of the core concepts that will perhaps be familiar to many of you listeners is this concept of Bhāva, this Sanskrit word Bhāva. This concept of Bhāva is connected to a theory of imagination that helps us to make sense of and contextualize the practices of visualization that are illustrated throughout the text. So on one particular day, I explored this concept of Bhāva, from which we get familiar words like bhavana, and so I thought I'd share it with you. Before we transition into it, a couple reminders. We do have a new YouTube channel, so if you're listening to this as audio and you want to follow us on YouTube, just go ahead and head to YouTube and search for Chitheads, and it should come up. And if you're a fan of the podcast and you've been listening for some time, or you're new and you feel like supporting us, you can offer a one-time donation at buymeacoffee.com/chitheads. That's buymeacoffee.com/chitheads. You can leave a donation for as little as $5. And if you do, I will mention your name on a future episode of the Chitheads podcast. It really does go a long way to supporting this work, and so I greatly appreciate it. Lastly, please consider leaving us a positive review on iTunes. They really do make an impact in getting this podcast out to those who've not discovered it yet. And so if you enjoy the podcast, please do consider leaving us a review on iTunes. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get right into the episode. Thanks for listening. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you happen to be in the world. Welcome back to day 4 of the 30-day sadhana, exploring the chakras and the yoginis from a particular text, as you know by now, the Matsyendrasaṃhitā. So today I wanted to unpack an important kind of theoretical concept, or what we could even describe it as the theory of the practice at the basis of the Matsyendrasaṃhitā, or the many different practices that we find in this text. There is as I had mentioned, I think in one of the earlier sessions, there's this theory of imagination that is really central not only to this text, but also to really the entire tantric tradition and yoga tradition. And it's when we really engage with it, it's quite a radical idea and really pushes back quite a bit against kind of our cultural presuppositions about, what the role of the imagination is and how it plays into reality itself and the creation, the radical creativity of our lives. So this term, which you're probably very familiar with if you are not new to the yoga tradition, is this term Bhāva, this Sanskrit word Bhāva. Now, Bhāva actually has a lot of different meanings. It means being, becoming. It has this sense of a state of things. You might have, if you're familiar with the Vaishnava tradition or the Bhakti tradition, you often hear people say, I'm in the bhav, right? I'm in the mood, in other words. So bhava, this word of mood or kind of disposition, it means a state of being, but also a state of becoming. And we find it in words like bhavana, which maybe some of you are familiar with. This term means, well, it's often translated, in my view, somewhat problematically as meditation, because of course, what do we mean by meditation here? But bhavana is really better translated, particularly in the context of many facets of the tantric tradition, as creative contemplation, or Kiss defines it as empathic imagination. And so, what does this have to do with our practices, right? This is just a bit from one of the articles by this very celebrated scholar, Alexis Sanderson. Perhaps some of you have heard of him. And I think he captures really beautifully here what kind of what bhavana is really all about, or this term bhava and its role and meaning in the context of tantric practice. The thinking which the theorists of the Siddhanta, right? Siddhanta, the Shaiva Siddhanta, is sort of the earliest form of Shaivism, or at least the most organized form of Shaivism, because we could say there was proto-Shaivism all the way back to the Vedas in the form of Rudra. But the Shaiva Siddhanta is kind of the dualistic Shaiva tradition that was the precursor to the more esoteric and non-dual traditions that were oriented around the goddess. So reading this again, the thinking which the theorists of the Siddhanta had in mind was not the cognition of a fact, but a kind of mental work which produces a result through effort. It is seen as imagination with the power to cross from the imaginary, kalpanikam, to the real, satyam. So transcending the dichotomy between these domains, which marks the world on which ritual works, ritual being kind of a particularly important in the Siddhanta, but also it becomes more internalized within the more esoteric meditative traditions of non-dual tantra, which of course, when we're doing our visualization, we are doing a form of internal ritual, right? And in the earlier dualistic traditions, it was more ritual was performed externally primarily, in a very similar way, that's analogous to kind of the Vedic Brahminical tradition of performing these various sacrifices and rituals of honoring the various deity forms. But it's not that the non-dual esoteric practitioners didn't participate in external rituals. It's just that they would have also been performing these internal rituals through meditation, and from the perspective of their philosophy and cosmology, this was actually a more important part of it. And in some sense, the external ritual was sort of, in some sense, superfluous, even though they might perform it almost at a cultural level, right? It was sort of necessary to stay rooted in the cultural milieu, at least according to the Tantrikas. Anyway, that's another topic. So getting back to this, it is certainly the case that the effect, namely Shivaness, is made present in the mind of the ritual agent. But this is not because his ritual has become cognition of a fact, in this instance recognition of self, but rather because it is the nature of tantric ritual to realize in this way what is desired and not yet existent. So this is really fascinating, and I think when we really kind of wrestle with it a little bit, it implies something quite radical, which is that when we are performing bhavana and we're performing ritual, it is not that we are even necessarily relating to a pre-existing entity. Is that through the power of our imagination, which is this divine faculty that we have that was offered by the fabric of reality of itself, which is our true nature, that this power of imagination actually has the capacity to bring into being the deity as in identification with ourselves. So if, for example, we are skeptical about well, is this a real quality, is this a real thing, it's almost beside the point according to this theory, because what we are doing is actually attempting to cultivate a state of divinity that didn't exist before. So in a sense, it's sort of irrelevant whether or not these deity forms are existing independent of us. The idea is that we are calling them into being, we're actually creating them. So this idea almost that God is not yet here in some way, or use whatever substitute for the divine you like, and that God is yet to come through the cultivation and creation and creative capacity of our practice, which I think is just a really, I feel like you don't find this in many other places besides the Tantric tradition. It's really quite fascinating. So this is from the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra, my translation of verse 20. So it's Shakyavasta pravishtasya nirvibhaghena bhavana tadasau shivarupi syat shaivi mukham ihuchyate. When of the one who has entered pravishtasya, the state of asta of Shakti, through empathic imagination, so I'm using the translation of Kiss here, of bhavana, or you could replace it with creative contemplation if you like, but really not just a kind of empty meditation, but really a very active, visual, imaginative meditation here is what we're talking about. Such a one has an understanding of reality. So what does that mean? So by virtue of harnessing the power of one's imagination, we also, at the same time, are understanding reality in a particular way. Without distinction, one would then be in that state of the form of Shiva. So in this state of a radical, liberated creativity, capable of bringing into being a state of being that is divine, is just to be in a state that is the form of Shiva. And it is declared in the agamas that this is the door, right? Our creative contemplation, our bhavana practice is the door of Shiva, or the divine, or that state of yoga that we are seeking to accomplish through practice. It really, in some sense, I got an email, and this always happens a little bit, and I sometimes when I start teaching, I often start with really trying to discuss the difference in deity, what deity means in these traditions. Of course, there are a whole host of a range of styles of relationship with what deity is. And for some people, a very kind of, maybe traditional is the wrong word, but an understanding of it is a real being and the personified expressions of it. That's how it looks like, and it's out there, and I'm going to relate to it. But, and I mean, even to some degree, also Western religious traditions also have much more esoteric, mystical understandings of what the divine is that often gets lost in kind of the rigid forms of religion that get, passed down to us and kind of dominate our cultural environment. But the conceptions of deity here are much more subtle and radical. It's really about almost like a pragmatic, these are pragmatic tools, and this is a kind of sense of deity that is you find in both Hindu Tantra and Tibetan Tantra, Tibetan Buddhism, that these are visualization tools that are capable of channeling and facilitating the accomplishment of certain states and the ability of us to cultivate these states. So we are using, they are devices, they are real in a sort of qualitative sense, but they are also, in a sense, already aspects of who we are. But because we don't have any symbols or knowledge systems to help us connect to these latent faculties that we have within us, the Tantric traditions are offering us essentially tools for us to essentially awaken dormant faculties and capacities that already pre-exist. You could think about it even in terms of, neurochemistry, and I obviously know nothing about brain science, but, there's this common, right, thing that people will point to about how we only use a certain portion of our brain, and like there's this huge swath of the brain that's not active and blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, there's also the evidence showing how in certain meditative states, contemplative states, neuroscientists are seeing, who are willing to actually explore this, all sorts of other areas of the brain light up. That's another sort of topic for another day. But but you can think about it in terms of like, that there are these essentially, there's a corresponding brain state for all these faculties and dispositions and ways of seeing, ways of perceiving our reality that are not yet available to us. And the question is, well, why? And one answer to that is that our cultural conditioning just does not have a place for any of these things, right? When we look back anthropologically at other traditions, including the Sanskrit tradition, yoga tradition, there's so many things we read that don't make any sense to us because we don't have the cultural lexicon to find kind of analogous understandings, and that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't at some point understand it in some visceral way. So we draw on our contemplative practices in a sense to cultivate the possibility of these states in our lives, and the traditions of philosophical inquiry, the knowledge systems, the texts themselves. These are profoundly important because they essentially open up our imagination to possibilities that we don't even know are there. Right. And also, they allow us to see the way in which our own cultural conditioning is, in some sense, just a kind of arbitrary expression, historically contingent expression of the possibilities of human imagination. Right. And so we're quite radical in that way, quite antinomian in pushing back and saying, no, the imagination isn't just something in the realm of fantasy. It's not just something for kids or artists. It is active in everything that we do, whether we recognize it or not. And actually, in a lot of ways, the cultural imagination is what dominates our imagination. And, one of the things that perhaps we could say happens from childhood into adulthood is the kind of liberty, the freedom, the playfulness of imagination gets sort of muscled down by all of these cultural forces that essentially domesticate our imagination. So yeah. So anyway, that's Bhava. So let's go ahead and practice, shall we?